This poor family had hoped to rely on the wheat from the autumn harvest to survive the winter. However, a dull thunderclap in the night suddenly jolted the man awake from his sleep. He saw a red glow outside, and it was clear that the barn storing their wheat was on fire. The whole family rushed out to try to put out the flames, but the fire was too fierce, and a small amount of water was completely useless. This unexpected blaze not only destroyed their last remaining food supply, but also pushed the entire family to the brink of starvation, with no way left to survive. The husband Karl took out a promotional newspaper and sincerely told his wife that he wanted to lead the family to the American continent to pursue a new life as immigrants. He spoke of fertile land where, as long as one was willing to work hard, everyone could become their own master. But such unrealistic dreams were immediately rejected by Kristina.
Hur tänker du? Du har ju ingen aning om vad Amerika är för något. Du vet ingenting.
Karl only wanted his family to live a better life, and he refused to let his children repeat the fate of their ancestors, who depended on the weather and were crushed by heavy taxes on this barren land. Yet in his wife's eyes, the idea of moving the entire family overseas was simply impossible, but fate had other plans. The next morning, the village pastor stood in the church urging every household to donate a little food to help the northern villages where famine was growing worse. Having heard people talking about America, the pastor also called on the villagers to abandon the idea of emigrating, claiming that those so-called lands of freedom were an illusion and that trusting in God was far more reliable. Karl could not understand the pastor's words and left the crowd in frustration. Although his wife was a devout believer, when there was no food on the table, faith alone could not sustain them. After the prayer gathering ended, several villagers came to Kristina. Knowing that her family had just suffered a fire and lost all their stored grain, they offered some food to help her through this difficult time. Kindness could still be found among people, and this goodwill from their neighbors felt like a small fire on a cold day, warming Kristina's heart. At that moment, a woman known throughout the village for her fallen reputation approached from a distance. It seemed that a man had taken advantage of her services without paying, and she had come to the prayer gathering pretending to be pious. So she angrily demanded her payment. The pastor stepped forward and warned her not to disturb the devout believers. The irony was striking. Under the banner of redemption, they tolerated and enabled dirty dealings. The sheriff coldly ordered her to leave immediately. The woman only wanted what she was owed, yet she was ruthlessly knocked to the ground. At that time, a woman like her had no rights, and everyone in the parish believed her presence would taint this so-called sacred place. Kristina silently witnessed everything from the side. The woman mistook Kristina's gaze for mockery and lashed out at her with harsh words. In the end, the sheriff forcibly drove the woman away. In truth, she and Kristina were both struggling at the bottom of society, only their ways of surviving were completely different. Afterward, the husband quietly took the children home. As the days passed, the family grew poorer, and cruel misfortune crept closer. One day, Kristina cooked a pot of oatmeal and had just poured it into a bowl when the starving second daughter rushed forward. Desperate to eat, the older sister immediately stopped her. Only after the oatmeal cooled and expanded could each person receive a small portion that barely eased their hunger. But a short while later, when Kristina returned to serve the porridge, the entire pot had mysteriously disappeared. She asked every family member, but no one knew what had happened. Only the second daughter was nowhere to be found. Kristina rushed outside to search for her. She found her daughter Anna under a large tree. The situation became extremely delicate. The girl had eaten the entire pot of porridge, leaving her in severe discomfort and unable to move. Because oatmeal expands in the stomach, it could cause a rupture, and the food needed to be removed immediately. When the father learned of this, he attempted to intervene using a crude and unskilled method. After some time, the girl showed no improvement. The family stayed by her side, hoping for a miracle, but heartbreakingly, she did not survive, and passed away quietly in her sleep. Anna's death dealt a devastating emotional blow to the family. Her mother fell into deep self-blame, believing she had failed to care for her child and allowed her daughter to die from hunger and excess. Guilt and grief nearly broke her, and she began to question her faith. If God was truly merciful, why would an innocent child be allowed to die? From that moment on, Kristina's faith began to waver. Meanwhile, when she could not find her husband late at night, she went outside to search for him. She discovered Karl in the woodshed, working through the night to build a coffin for their daughter.
Jag skulle ha ställt gröten här grupp. Varför tog han henne?
Det var inte kul. Det var hungern.
seeing her husband on the verge of an emotional breakdown, Kristina realized that their old life had completely fallen apart. They had lost every reason to stay, and all that remained was to leave. Perhaps only through loss can a family truly take the road of departure. So the next day, after their daughter was buried, Kristina also asked her husband to take them away as immigrants.
Jag följer dig. Om du tror att det är bäst för oss, så följer jag dig.
On the day of departure, Kristina's father gave her a Swedish apple tree. Her mother, however, appeared deeply disappointed and shut the door without even offering a word of blessing. It was clear that the old woman did not agree with their decision, but the choice to emigrate was already final, and no reluctance could shake the couple's resolve. And so, the family set out toward a world that was both distant and unfamiliar. A few days later, they finally boarded a sailing ship bound for America. Many fellow countrymen gathered there, and it was obvious that everyone shared the same desire to escape poverty. But unexpectedly, Kristina encountered the fallen woman once again. Their conflict was bound to intensify, and even more unforeseen hardships were about to unfold. At this point, the first chapter of the migration came to an end. The opening chapter of the migration uses a stark tone to strip away the survival struggles of 19th-century European farmers. The burning of the granary and the death of the young daughter shattered Kristina's attachment to her homeland. Faith appears fragile in the face of hunger, and the warmth of neighbors cannot overcome structural poverty. Through the deadly oatmeal and the parallel editing of the pastor's sermon, the director delivers a sharp critique of the emptiness of religion, as the sound of Karl hammering the coffin at midnight blends with the crackling of firewood. The traditional patriarchal society is revealed as a swamp that devours life. The daughter's death becomes a cruel footnote to the migration, and the pursuit of a golden land is nothing more than a forced escape born from a broken civilization. The reunion with the fallen woman in the ship's cabin foreshadows that the new world is not a paradise, but another testing ground of human nature. Are people struggling at the bottom truly suited for migration? After their granary was destroyed by fire, one of the daughters, weakened by prolonged hunger, secretly ate an entire pot of porridge and died from it. A series of tragic events left the farming family in unbearable suffering, forcing them to choose migration and leave their homeland behind as they boarded a ship to North America. Yet the road ahead was filled with unknown dangers. The story continues into the second part of the migration, beginning with Kristina's family aboard the immigrant ship. At first, the journey felt hopeful, and the Swedish passengers longed for the freedom of the new world. But as time passed, some people could not endure the long voyage and began to suffer from seasickness. Not only that, the dark and crowded cabins led to infestations of lice among the passengers.
Har du läst för att hålla undan från oss?
Jag har aldrig haft en lus på kroppen i hela mitt liv.
Two women from the same hometown already had conflicts, so Ulrika accused Kristina of keeping her distance to avoid spreading lice. Kristina, however, believed that Ulrika had long been engaged in an unclean profession and had no right to accuse others. Unexpectedly, Ulrika tried to prove her cleanliness by lifting her clothes for others to see, displaying a shocking lack of shame. It is hard to imagine that, even in such desperate circumstances, they could not find peace. But this was only a minor episode during the voyage, as far greater threats came from natural disasters and disease. The next morning, a person who had died from dysentery was discovered and was quickly thrown into the sea by the crew. Once such a disease begins, it spreads rapidly among the passengers. Watching the rats crawling around, Kristina felt nothing but lingering fear. Sure enough, the following day, under the pastor's prayers, several more lives were lost. In the mid-19th century, such tragedies were an inevitable part of long sea voyages, and reaching the American continent alive depended entirely on fate. Even though people died every day, most passengers managed to keep their spirits, using songs to ease their sorrow. In truth, they had come to accept life and death, leaving everything to chance. But the sea is unpredictable, and one night a violent storm suddenly struck. People were awakened from their sleep by the violently rocking ship. Some began to vomit, while others trembled in fear in the corners. If seawater flooded the cabin, they would all perish. As the saying goes, fortune comes with risk, and to reach the beautiful and fertile new world, one must endure unimaginable hardships. Fortunately, after a night of chaos, the sky finally cleared, and the exhausted passengers gathered on the deck. At that moment, someone suddenly noticed seagulls flying in the sky. The appearance of seagulls meant that land was not far away, yet they did not fully realize it until a man shouted out the name. America! After 2 months of crossing the Atlantic, these Swedish travelers finally saw the American continent. Soft sunlight merged with the vast horizon. At that moment, Kristina's eyes filled with tears, not of pure joy, but of something far more complex. She felt awe, fear, and relief all at once, as if she had finally climbed out of hell only to face an unknown world. Perhaps this is the price of rebirth. They had lost everything, but at last, they had gained a chance. A family of 5, along with the child growing inside Kristina, gazed excitedly at the land just within reach, a symbol of hope and a redefinition of their fate. With simple luggage, they stepped onto the port of New York. Because there were many family members, Kristina reminded her daughter to keep a close eye on her younger brother and not let him get lost. The city was even more bustling than they had imagined, filled with people of all kinds. At that moment, a Chinese man with a long braid approached them to strike up a conversation. He made a living at the port by acting as a guide and earning commissions, but when Karl used a phrasebook and clumsily said Minnesota in broken English, the man immediately panicked and walked away. Perhaps in those brief seconds, a deeper cultural reality was revealed. Karl's family was not alone, but part of a larger wave of migration. They were about to enter a world where languages, appearances, and destinies intertwined, deepening Kristina's confusion and fear. Meanwhile, a Swedish man from the same ship noticed Karl's family and said he could speak simple English and guide them to Minnesota for a fee of $5. $5 was too much for Karl, and he refused to be taken advantage of by a fellow countryman the moment they arrived. At that moment, the woman who had once conflicted with Kristina stepped forward. She also wanted to go to Minnesota with her daughter and offered to share part of the cost. To reduce the burden, Karl finally paid $3, and they headed to a nearby train station. Everything seemed to go smoothly, and as the train slowly arrived, they carried their luggage into the carriage. But at the most critical moment, Kristina's eldest daughter suddenly disappeared. The train was about to depart, and the loss of the child would be a devastating blow to the family. Kristina wandered through the noisy crowd, staring at unfamiliar faces with a growing sense of dread. She screamed her daughter's name, but her voice was swallowed by the piercing whistle of the train. At the same time, her husband desperately tried to communicate with the staff to delay the departure, but they could not understand each other. With no other choice, the couple searched frantically. Just as the train began to move, a voice called out from the distance. It was Ulrika, who had found Kristina's daughter and shouted loudly enough to make the staff halt the train in confusion. It had not been easy, but they finally boarded at the last moment. And all of this was thanks to Ulrika, the very woman who once clashed with Kristina. Perhaps some people appear defiant on the surface, yet carry kindness deep within. For the first time, Kristina felt a sense of guilt.
Jag vill bara säga tack för det du gjorde för din Marta. Jag gjorde bara vad varje förnuftig människa hade gjort.
She had always looked down on Ulrika, believing her to be immoral and unworthy of equal respect. Ulrika, on the other hand, carried both defiance and pain, challenging those who claimed purity. When Ulrika helped find the child, she not only saved a mother, but also restored Kristina's faith in humanity. At that moment, Kristina realized that even in a foreign land, there were still people worth trusting and loving, so the conversation on the train became more than words. It became a reconciliation of the soul and a quiet rebirth. This marks the end of the second chapter of The Emigrants. The second chapter uses the voyage as a microcosm, forging suffering into something epic. The ship's cabin is not just a confined space, but an arena where class and morality collide. Conflict and division tear away the illusion of civilization, and the clash and reconciliation between Kristina and Ulrika reveal the paradox of dignity in desperate circumstances. In the face of life and death, prejudice becomes meaningless. As seagulls cross the sky, life and death have already formed a silent pact amid the waves. The chaos of New York Harbor brings no peace, but instead questions the spiritual cost of migration through the terror of a missing child. The film's deepest message lies in the idea that the freedom they sought by abandoning their homeland must ultimately be redeemed through a renewed belief in humanity. A woman who had just settled in the wilderness suddenly noticed a stranger standing not far behind her. The unexpected encounter left the Swedish woman shaken to her core. This was Kristina's first confrontation with Native Americans after arriving on the American continent. The story continues into the third chapter of The Emigrants. The Swedish immigrants traveled by train from New York to distant Minnesota. Knowing the children were starving, Karl bought 2 pieces of buttered bread at a transfer station. The family was overjoyed, because they had never tasted such delicious food even back home. At that moment, Kristina noticed Ulrika's child quietly watching them, remembering the help she had received. Kristina did not hesitate to share the bread. This small gesture may seem insignificant, but in an age of famine and scarcity, bread was not just food, it was life itself. It marked the first time Kristina actively extended kindness, breaking through her long-held prejudice and guarded heart, they crossed dry wastelands, passed rolling hills, traveled through dark and silent valleys, and finally reached Minnesota by ferry. The journey was long, but they had finally arrived at their destination. After completing his task, the guide bid farewell to Karl's family. Karl still wanted to distance himself from Ulrika and her daughter, but to Kristina, Ulrika was someone who had helped them, and she refused to abandon her. They continued forward through unfamiliar towns, but hunger soon drove them to seek food at a nearby inn. Karl entered the restaurant and tried to communicate with the owner using simple English words. Although the owner understood, he deliberately brought out something unpleasant to humiliate the foreigner. Just as the family stood helpless, a man stepped forward to greet them. Seeing their cautious expressions, the man introduced himself as a pastor who recognized them as newcomers and wished to help. There is no such thing as a free meal. So what was his true intention? Strangely enough, he seemed immediately interested in Ulrika and deliberately asked about her while preparing food. When he learned that Ulrika's husband had died, he became unusually eager and even offered them towels so they could wash before eating. Even a devout pastor, in a place lacking women, could not hide his human desires. Meanwhile, Karl carefully studied a map, searching for a suitable place to settle, to help them avoid Native Americans. The pastor marked several relatively safe locations for Karl to consider. Later, after Kristina finished washing and went outside to find her husband, she discovered that he was still examining the land late into the night. For a farmer, nothing is more important than the promise of land. He told his wife that the soil here was not much better than back home, so Karl made a decision to set out alone the next day to search for a place in the north where they could truly survive. Staying in the pastor's home for too long was not a solution. Kristina knew her husband was stubborn, and after failing to persuade him, she had no choice but to accept his decision. In the days after he left, Kristina fell into deep anxiety, fearing that her husband might encounter unknown dangers in this unfamiliar world. All she could do was worry. Fortunately, Ulrika stayed by her side, offering understanding and strength during her loneliest days. A few evenings later, as they walked through the streets, the determined man finally returned. The next morning, the family began preparing their belongings. Kristina wanted to invite Ulrika to join them, but Ulrika had found her own place and firmly declined. After a reluctant farewell, the family set out once again to find and build their own land, but reality was far from their imagination. After traveling for some time, they had to cross dense rivers and move through dark forests. The isolation of the place made Kristina even more uneasy. After crossing mountains, they finally reached the chosen location. Karl had even built a small cabin in advance so they would have shelter upon arrival. But to Kristina, the dream of a better life shattered instantly. As this place felt no different from pure wilderness survival, she could not imagine the hardships ahead, nor did she have the courage to confront her husband's feelings, so she wept silently in the darkness. The next morning marked the beginning of their new life. Karl left early, leaving the women and children uncertain of what to do. Kristina remembered the apple tree she had brought from Sweden, and although its leaves had withered and turned yellow, she decided to plant it in the soil as a small hope for the future and a bit of joy for the children. But while she went to fetch water by the river, something unexpected happened. A figure she had never seen before stood behind her. While her eldest daughter screamed from the riverbank, Kristina sensed danger and realized it might be Native Americans. She quietly told her daughter to find her father, then hurried back into the cabin, holding her crying child as she prepared for what might come. The stranger curiously searched through the cabin. When he noticed a gun placed above the doorframe, the situation instantly became tense. The man picked up the weapon and aimed it at the frightened mother and child. Despite Kristina's desperate pleas, he seemed unmoved. At that moment, a voice from outside called out, possibly from a leader summoning him. The man did not fire, but instead took a few interesting items before leaving the cabin. But soon after, Kristina felt a sharp pain in her abdomen, likely triggered by the shock, and it seemed her childbirth would come early. In this isolated land with no help available, what kind of ordeal awaited her next? This marks the end of the third chapter of The Emigrants. The third chapter deeply portrays the gap between dreams and reality. When Kristina steps onto the land her husband struggled to find, the barren and desolate landscape instantly shatters her vision of a new home, filling her with regret and despair. Yet this disillusionment sets the stage for her later encounter with Native Americans, forcing her to face primal fear and the challenge of survival on the edge of civilization. From sharing bread to protecting her children, Kristina transforms from someone who once fled into someone who stands and defends. The land she once despised will ultimately become the home she must fight to protect.